So over the last week, I did a number of videos on the Kerch Bridge. It looks like the dust has settled and I can explain it in its entirety at this point, and I'm going to try to do that. So if you want to see the earlier videos, how Russia explains the Kerch, or is it a legitimate target or terror, or the way that they unpack it on Russian TV, they're simply losing it, I would advise you to go do that. But here's what's happened with the Kerch. So the Kerch Bridge is a pretty significant symbol to Russia. I was explaining to my live Q&A this morning that I grew up 20 miles outside New York City, and we could see the Twin Towers in some parts of my towns. When I was an adult living in Virginia when the Twin Towers were hit, but it felt like a punch in the gut. I really felt it. And that's because it was such a symbolic thing. And that's what happened with the Kerch. That's why the Kerch, on top of that, it has military value because it can be, transport can come in and there's a way in and out, another route other than going back through the occupied areas. So the Kerch was important for a number of reasons. They crippled it. How did they cripple it? Well, it could have come from Odessa. It could have come from the north. There was a theory about that as well. We don't know, but we do know that it was a waterborne attack, not necessarily under, it could have been on the water, but it was a waterborne attack, and it wasn't missiles, and nobody was saying it was missiles. Nobody's saying it's not Ukraine. Everybody agrees on these kinds of facts. In Ukraine, there was great rejoicing, as you are well aware. You probably saw this video. Okay, so yeah, we're very happy to see that happening. Now, and they knew what was going to happen. They knew that Odessa, or at least other places, would be struck. They didn't know exactly where it was. Now, I get a lot of questions about whether the Kerch Bridge sealed the grain deal for Putin. The grain deal was already off the table. They weren't going to do that. They wanted to end that. The timing just happened to line up. It's not because of the Kerch. But then what Russia did do in order to continue to scuttle the grain deal was to attack Odessa and the grain stores and things along those lines. And so what they were doing was hitting essentially civilian and port kind of places that were, and they complained about terrorism on the Kerch. The Kerch Bridge was terrorism, and I showed that again and again. It's terrorism, it's terrorism, it's terrorism. No, it's not. But what you did in response actually was terrorism, hitting civilian residential buildings. So that's terrorism. So don't believe what Russia says when they say the Kerch was terrorism. It's not. It's a legitimate artery. Now, why did they do this legitimate artery? And that's interesting. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. I'm also going to give you a broader context from Peter Zion, talking about look, Crimea is really in a hurt here. And the strike on the Kerch was a big part of what's going on. The dam, the Kakhovka Dam, sealed its fate, and the Kerch is accelerating it. Here, let's hear what he has to say first.
When the Kakhovka Reservoir drained, it dropped the water level below what was necessary to fill the irrigation trenches, and that is bad for Zaporizhzhia, that is bad for Kherson, that is bad for Crimea. So the Russians no longer have the capacity to bring in food in volume, which means unless the Russians want to face the mother of all global embarrassments and have the entire Russian population of Crimea, of which there's over 2 million people, plus 100-odd thousand Russian troops, become hostages of the Ukrainians, they need to start a mass evacuation as soon as possible. My guess is...
Yeah, that's really an interesting thought, right? I mean, what happened? What would that look like on the world stage if Peter's correct? I don't know that that's what's going to happen, but it's a really interesting insight. Now, couple that with these remarks from Military Summary. This came out, somebody actually sent this to me the day after the Kerch was struck, because Military Summary is a kind of pro-Russian site that they lean toward a pro-Russian perspective, but they can be insightful periodically. I don't talk about them very often, but I have with the Kerch. And here's what happened. So they strike the bridge, which means that now if people want to get out of Crimea, they have to go this way back out through the contested, occupied areas. And that creates a whole different problem set. So they're saying, well, why didn't they strike the rail? Things come through rail. They do come through rail. But by striking the bridge itself, it creates problems and bottlenecks elsewhere. Just listen.
So, one more time, what was the purpose of that attack? And now we're coming to the most interesting part of the story. So, the thing is that the Ukrainians haven't managed to destroy the railroad support. They haven't managed to achieve a lot during that attack. But somewhere at 1 p.m. of the local time, we got a very interesting piece of news from the territory of South Zaporozhye area and Kherson area. There is like icon, I have already added the icon, and the sources were saying that somewhere at 1 p.m. there was a real traffic jam in 25 kilometers. So this icon is geolocated, and basically the traffic jam took place somewhere on this line. We will add this with red color. So this territory was at 1 p.m. of the local time, was completely blacked, and the Russians, neither Russian locals, people, military forces were able to use this part of the road for transferring, for moving and so on, because this area was completely blacked because of traffic jam. I'll remind you that during the special military operation, we know that there are very fierce fightings in Zaporozhye, South Donetsk area, and there is one...
I want to stop there for just a moment to make 3 comments. So the first is that this created this immediate traffic jam of people trying to get out of Crimea, that, like, why they're there in the first place. It baffles me that you'd want to go to right next to a war zone for vacation. But let's say, so they're trying to get out of Crimea, and this is creating a traffic jam on the road. And others, like military, need to use that road for other things, right? So it blocks off one exit. It creates a traffic jam on another exit, and that can cause significant headaches for the opposition. So one of the things that I understand that a military wants to do is create headaches for the other side, where they have to choose between which headache are they going to deal with, and they've done that with the Kerch. So it's not just knocking out the road, it's also creating this extra obstacle here. Second thing I want to show is that when you hear somebody talk, if they're talking about the special military operation, generally that's a dog whistle to the Russian side to say, hey, we're pro-Russian, as opposed to saying the war or what's going on in Ukraine or whatever else. Third, I talked about in another video this past week, I talked about how the counteroffensive was going and why it was so bad. But look at all the trench lines and things up here, right? All the troops, all the trench lines. If you want to understand why the war is going so slow, the counteroffensive is going so slow, watch that video. Okay, let's keep hearing what he has to say.
We know that there are very fierce fightings in Zaporozhye, South Donetsk area, and there is one important supply road that the Russians are using and are planning to use in the future between the front lines, between the combat lines. This is the main logistic road that the Russians use to send vehicles, armored vehicles, shells, munitions, reinforcements, reserves, and so on. And I'm talking about the road between Melitopol, this one, Berdyansk, and Mariupol. This is the first, biggest, and the most important.
Right, and so the Russians they're saying you can get out this way through this road. Jake Bro pointed out, and I think he's right, like, okay, they're sending civilians, like they're talking about how dangerous it is over on the bridge, sending civilians to go through this outlet, and this area is being, no problem, you can just go through the occupied territory. This road is being hammered, or areas around here are being hammered by the Ukrainians regularly as they're trying to wear down their opponent. So this is a pretty dangerous place. So they're creating a traffic jam, and the only alternative route out is going through a pretty dangerous place.
And supply road that the Russians used to during the previous counteroffensive operation, and the Russians were pretty flexible and mobile. They have repaired this road and so on. The second road that the Russians were using is the road between Melitopol and Crimea. This part of road the Russians were using to send strategical operational reserves and tactical reserves from Crimea in direction of South Donetsk area.
Okay, so this is important because if the Russians are using this tactical road and now the Ukrainians have overloaded it, that is a strategic objective. So it's not terrorism to do to the bridge if you can create their strategic objective through the process. And that's the very nature of whether something's a legitimate target or not.
And Zaporozhye area as well. So basically, we see that as a result of that attack, the Russians, there is a panic, and a lot of people who weren't able to use the ships between Crimea and mainland of Russia took a decision to go to the north and to use the main military Russian supply route for evacuation.
And the ships at the bottom, the ferries going across, have been taken over by the military apparently fairly recently to shuttle soldiers back and forth across. So that's not much of an option, or it hasn't been much of an option recently.
Of course, and now it's become more and more interesting, right? And after that, I tried to understand the real situation with jams, with traffic jam on this area. And for these purposes, I start using the Google Maps disappears and we stop receiving any updates about the traffic jam. But anyway, this red line tell us that the movements when in entering zone to this Zaporozhye and Kherson area have a very big traffic jam. So basically cars are standing there without any progress in the future further.
Okay, so it's not going to be ongoing traffic jams, but it's going to be thicker and it's going to become problematic for the Russians who have to deal with the civilians trying to get through, as well as getting their military vehicles and whatever else through. Now, the Russians really have tried to alleviate that, and here's how they've done it. They've kind of just boarded over, patched over a section of the lane that's still in place. It's really bizarre. I'm going to stop this at a certain place so that you can see this. And this was shown on other channels, but I just want to make sure, in case you haven't seen it, that there's just like this extra divot up, and he's going up over that. You see how he's going up over that little ridge? This is crazy dangerous, up over that ridge. Right? Look at the bridge itself. You see the difference where the guy's standing here. This is the bridge and this is the bridge, and those things are supposed to be united, and they just kind of, and they're letting one vehicle at a time go over that. See that? That's the separation that needs to be sorted out and fixed properly, and they've allowed some traffic over that, but that's crazy. It's not a good fix, but I'm sure they're getting some propaganda value out of saying, see, we have traffic restored on the bridge, and that's crazy. In the meantime, Medvedev was calling to destroy terrorist Ukrainian leadership. He was doubling down. The Russians were saying that what the Ukrainians did to the bridge was terrorism, but here's what he said ought to happen next. One needs to blow up their own houses and the houses of their relatives, find and eliminate their accomplices, abandoning the insipid idea of court trials against them. So you're not only going to go after them and blow up their houses, but also the houses of their relatives. So that's Medvedev talking about, like, this was terrorism, but I'm going to show you what real terrorism looks like. Okay, last bit that I'm going to talk about just for fun is, well, this again, because it's a great note to go out on. Thank you for caring enough to listen to this. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes. I hope that answers your questions about what happened with the Kerch Bridge attack. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. And let's end with this. No